Saipan, June 1944. The coral beaches burned under the Pacific sun, littered with wreckage and smoke. From the cliffs above, Japanese soldiers watched the sea turn black with landing craft. To them, the horizon wasn't a battlefield. It was the end of the world. For months, Imperial Army propaganda had told them what capture by the Americans meant, that surrender was worse than death, that the U.S. Marines would torture, mutilate, and kill anyone who laid down their arms, that to be taken alive was to bring eternal shame to one's ancestors. Every Japanese infantryman on Saipan carried two final possessions, a rifle and a single bullet for himself. In the caves that honeycombed the island's ridges, officers gave speeches that sounded less like strategy and more like funerals. "Remember," one captain told his men, "the enemy does not take prisoners. You will die as soldiers of the Emperor." The youngest among them, boys of 17 and 18, listened in silence. Outside, naval bombardments turned the jungle into a wall of flame. Above, the sky trembled under the sound of American carrier planes. The ground shook, the air burned, and still they believed what they had been told, that mercy was a lie invented by cowards. On the morning of June 15th, the Marines came ashore. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions landed through withering fire, wading through waist-deep water thick with coral and gasoline. Japanese machine guns, hidden in caves, tore into the surf. The first wave suffered heavy losses, but more landing craft followed, endless, mechanical, unstoppable. To the defenders watching through binoculars, the invasion seemed like the ocean itself had risen to swallow them. By nightfall, the beaches were secure. But the Marines had seen something strange. Not just the ferocity of the resistance, but the refusal to yield. Even wounded soldiers, those who could no longer fight, pulled grenades under their chests rather than be taken. It was the first sign that this war would not end like Europe's. Here, surrender was not an option. It was blasphemy. Days later, deep in the hills above Garapan, Corporal Joseph Martin of the 24th Marines led a small patrol into a ravine choked with banyan roots. They were hunting snipers, but what they found instead was silence, the kind that feels alive. Martin spotted movement near a crevice, a hand, trembling, bloodied, holding a bayonet. Then a voice, weak but desperate, shouting in Japanese. The Marines froze. No one fired. They'd been told to expect ambushes, booby traps, even suicide charges. But the hand didn't strike. It dropped the weapon. Out of the darkness, a young soldier emerged, his uniform shredded, his eyes hollow with terror. He raised his hands, slowly, shakily, then fell to his knees. The other Marines watched in disbelief. "Jesus," one muttered. "He's surrendering." It was the first Japanese surrender any of them had seen. At that moment, none of them knew what to do. There were no instructions. No one had imagined a scenario where a Japanese soldier would want to live. Martin hesitated. He looked at the boy, because that's what he was, barely 20, and noticed the cracked lips, the bleeding from sun and thirst. The Marine reached for his canteen. The prisoner flinched. He thought the gesture was a trick, a prelude to execution. But then Martin uncapped it and held it out. For a long moment, the Japanese soldier didn't move. Then with trembling hands, he accepted it. He drank, spilling half down his chin, gasping between swallows. And in that moment, something broke that no rifle or bomb could have shattered. The wall of fear that propaganda had built. The Marines took him back to their lines. He walked barefoot through the coral, head bowed, still expecting death. But instead of punishment, he was given medical treatment. A corpsman dressed his wounds and gave him a cigarette. Another Marine laughed, slapped him gently on the shoulder, and said, "You're lucky, pal. War's over for you." The prisoner didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. It wasn't cruelty. It was relief. That night, under guard, he wrote a single line in a notebook hidden inside his uniform. "The enemy is not as they said." It would be one of the first such notes recovered after the battle, a testimony that spread quietly among Japanese survivors, carried like a rumor of impossible mercy. But not everyone would live to see it. Saipan's hills and cliffs were filled with soldiers and civilians who believed death was the only honorable escape. Families jumped into the sea. Entire units detonated grenades together, shouting, "Banzai!" as they vanished in smoke. The Marines, hardened by combat but unprepared for such horror, tried to stop them. They shouted through megaphones, dropped leaflets promising safety, even sent captured soldiers forward to beg their comrades to surrender. Few listened. To most, surrender still meant dishonor. Better to die cleanly by one's own hand than to drink the enemy's water. And yet, somewhere, deep in the caves of Saipan, a single Marine's act of compassion had begun to travel through whispers, that there were Americans who didn't shoot the wounded, who shared food, who gave water. It was an idea as dangerous as any weapon. By the time Saipan fell in July 1944, over 29,000 Japanese soldiers had died. Fewer than 1,000 were captured alive. But among those survivors, stories began to surface of Marines who spared prisoners, who carried them to safety, who refused to kill when they could have. And for the first time in the Pacific War, the myth of the merciless American began to crack. The Japanese soldier's diary, recovered by intelligence officers weeks later, contained one final line before its pages ended. "If there are such men, then perhaps we were wrong." The Americans called it Hell with a Horizon, a chain of volcanic islands, each one a fortress, each one a death trap. From Saipan to Peleliu, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa, every battle unfolded the same way. The sea boiling with shells, the land erupting with fire, and men on both sides learning that the Pacific wasn't water. It was blood. But within that fire, something began to change. The Marines had learned the pattern of Japanese resistance. No retreat, no surrender, no prisoners. Every cave, every bunker had to be burned, buried, or stormed by hand. The enemy never yielded. Even after bullets were gone, they attacked with bayonets, swords, even rocks. And yet, as the campaigns dragged on, American troops began to notice something. Exhaustion, hesitation, the smallest cracks in the myth of absolute resistance. They started to see fear. At Peleliu, September 1944, temperatures on the ridges reached 115 degrees. The coral was so hot that Marines burned their palms on their rifles. The island was tiny, barely 6 miles long, but defended by over 10,000 Japanese troops who had sworn to fight to the last. For weeks, they did. But when the shelling never stopped and food ran out, desperation turned to delirium. One Marine patrol reported finding a Japanese position littered with empty canteens and scraps of paper covered in shaky handwriting. Fragments of letters, prayers, and orders written in the same trembling brushstrokes. "We are forbidden to surrender. If captured, die immediately. Americans drink the blood of the dead." Those were the words they lived by, and died by. But on the 14th day of the battle, something unexpected happened again. A Marine flamethrower team advancing through a burned-out ridge spotted movement inside a cave. They readied their weapons. One shouted in Japanese, "Come out!" No answer. The man aimed his flamethrower. Then, a voice. Weak, broken, but unmistakably human. "Water." The Marines froze. They looked at one another. This wasn't the voice of a fanatic. It was the voice of a dying man. They approached cautiously, rifles ready, hearts pounding. Inside, they found 3 Japanese soldiers. One was already dead. The other 2 were badly burned. barely conscious. When they saw the Marines, they tried to crawl away, expecting to be executed. Instead, one of the Americans, a private named Daniel "Red" Haskins from Kansas, knelt down, opened his canteen, and handed it to the nearest man. The Japanese soldier's lips quivered as he drank. He muttered something over and over. The same word. Arigato. It was the first Japanese word Haskins ever learned. Word spread through the platoon. Then the regiment. By the next day, Marines began to carry extra canteens during patrols, not for themselves, but for whoever might be found alive. They still fought with everything they had. There was no mercy in the trenches. But after the guns fell silent, something softer started to surface, an unspoken understanding that the men they were fighting weren't monsters. They were starving, terrified, and following a code that demanded they die rather than drink from an enemy's hand. And yet, every time one accepted that canteen, that code cracked a little more. For the Americans, it was confusing, even disorienting. They had been told that the Japanese would never surrender, that mercy was wasted, that kindness would get you killed. And often that was true. Many who pretended to surrender still had grenades hidden in their clothes. Marines learned caution the hard way, but there were also moments, rare, fragile, when they saw something unmistakably human. A wounded soldier whispering, "Mother," as he died. A medic from both sides meeting eyes over a stretcher. A silent nod across the smoke. The war in the Pacific was cruelty itself, but within it, these flickers of compassion were like sparks refusing to die in the wind. By 1945, those sparks had spread farther than either army realized. Reports from U.S. intelligence units began to note that some captured soldiers had been told by their superiors not to believe rumors of American kindness. It was becoming a problem, not for the Allies, but for Japan's military command, because mercy, once witnessed, was contagious. One translated diary recovered on Peleliu contained a line that startled even hardened officers. "If they are devils who give water to the dying." But mercy had a cost, too. For every Japanese soldier who accepted help, there were others who saw surrender as betrayal. Some turned their rifles on their own men, rather than let them be captured. One Marine reported finding 2 corpses in a cave, one shot in the back, one still holding an empty canteen. Even among the doomed, compassion carried risk. It defied orders. It broke the logic of war, but it also revealed something indestructible, that even in a world built on hate, humanity had its own insurgency. As the battles pushed northward toward Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the Marines carried not only their weapons, but their memories. The boy from Saipan, the dying men from Peleliu, the whispered arigato. They were learning something that couldn't be taught in boot camp. That victory wasn't just about surviving the fight, but surviving one's own heart. By the end of the Peleliu campaign, out of 10,795 Japanese defenders, only 202 were captured alive. But among those 202 were soldiers who told interrogators that they had seen something they didn't believe possible. Americans who spared the wounded, who treated prisoners, who even shared food and water. One of them said quietly, "We were told the enemy was without mercy. Now we know mercy has a face." Iwo Jima, February 1945. 8 square miles of black volcanic sand, smoking like the surface of another planet. Every inch of it defended by men who had sworn never to leave it alive. The Japanese called it the Sulphur Island. The Marines called it the place where God forgot us. From Mount Suribachi to the northern cliffs, the battlefield was an inferno of fire and grit. Mortar shells burst every 30 seconds, turning air into ash. Flamethrowers roared through tunnels. Machine guns rattled endlessly. The rhythm of hell itself. It was here, in that chaos that one of the war's most quietly powerful moments unfolded. The kind of moment that never made it into dispatches or victory speeches, but changed the men who lived it forever. Sergeant Walter Walt Dunham of the 28th Marines had been fighting for 5 days without sleep. He'd lost half his squad clearing a bunker line south of Motoyama Airfield. Every time they took one cave, another opened behind it, and from every cave came the same cry, not of surrender, but defiance. Tenno Heika Banzai. For the Emperor, Dunham didn't hate them. He was too tired for hate. He just wanted it to end. Late one afternoon, his patrol came across a half-collapsed tunnel entrance. Steam rose from the black sand. Inside, they could hear muffled groans. Wounded men, maybe trapped. One of the privates raised his flamethrower. Dunham stopped him. "Hold it," he said. "They're not shooting." They waited. Minutes passed, then a whisper drifted out. Not a battle cry, but a plea. "Mizu, Wanagai, water, please." The Marines looked at each other. It was the same word Haskins had heard on Peleliu months earlier, the same word that had crossed the language barrier before any peace treaty could. Against every instinct, Dunham took off his helmet, crouched, and crawled toward the entrance. A single bullet could have killed him, but none came. Inside, the air was thick with sulfur and blood. He found 3 Japanese soldiers. 2 were dead. The third was young, barely 20, lying against the wall, both legs shattered, clutching an empty canteen. When Dunham appeared, the boy tensed, eyes wide with terror. Dunham slowly raised his hands, showing he meant no harm. He unscrewed his canteen, poured a little water into the cap, and set it down beside him. Then he backed away. The soldier stared, disbelieving. For 10 seconds he didn't move. Then, shaking, he reached forward and drank. No words were spoken. Just breathing. 2 men on opposite sides of a war, sharing the same human silence. Later that night, after the area was secured, Dunham returned with a corpsman. The young Japanese soldier was still alive. He didn't resist when they carried him out. In the medical tent, he tried to speak in broken English. All he managed to say was, "You, good man, not devil." The corpsman smiled and handed him a second canteen. "Neither are you, buddy," he said. That moment, recorded in a field journal and later found by historians, became one of the few documented instances of mutual mercy on Iwo Jima, an island that otherwise knew none. When Dunham's company learned what he had done, the reactions were mixed. Some called it brave. Others said it was reckless. "Could have been a trick," one Marine muttered. But Dunham didn't care. He wrote in his own journal that night, "If this war ever ends, maybe it'll be because one man gave another man water." He didn't know it, but that prisoner survived the war. His name was Corporal Yukio Tanabe, 21 years old, from Nagoya. After being treated in a field hospital, he was sent to a POW camp in Hawaii, one of the few captured at Iwo Jima. Years later, Tanabe would tell interviewers that the memory of that Marine haunted him for decades, not as an enemy, but as a revelation. "They told us Americans had no soul," he said, "but I saw mercy with my own eyes." In the Pacific, such encounters were almost mythic, too rare to seem real, too powerful to forget. They spread as whispers among prisoners, carried in fragments of rumor that defied censorship. A Marine who shared water, a corpsman who saved an enemy's life, an American who refused to hate. And those whispers, multiplied across camps and islands, began to do what propaganda never could. They humanized the enemy. Back on Iwo Jima, Dunham didn't live to see the end. He was killed 2 weeks later on Hill 362A. When his body was found, his canteen was empty. But the man he had saved lived, and carried that act with him for the rest of his life. In 1968, Tanabe visited Hawaii again, this time as a tourist, a grandfather, and a pacifist. He stood before a marble monument bearing the names of fallen Marines. Somewhere among them was Dunham's. Tanabe placed a white chrysanthemum at its base and whispered in English, "Thank you for the water." In a war remembered for fire and fury, that one gesture, a canteen passed between enemies, survived as proof that compassion could exist even in hell. And for the men who heard about it, on both sides, it became something sacred, a reminder that the enemy was never faceless, only human, and that even in the darkest tunnel, mercy could still find a way in. The war was over. The world had split the atom, burned cities into shadows, and watched empires vanish in smoke. But from the ashes of the Pacific, something unexpected took root. Something small, quiet, and stubborn. It wasn't political. It wasn't strategic. It was human. It was the memory of mercy. From Saipan to Okinawa, from the jungles of New Guinea to the prison camps of Hawaii, the same story kept surfacing in letters, in journals, in trembling testimonies before peace tribunals. That compassion in the face of hatred had survived. That men who were taught to dehumanize had rediscovered the meaning of being human. In Japan's ruins, that memory mattered more than any declaration. Cities like Hiroshima and Nagasaki had become open wounds, physical and moral. But as Allied troops occupied the islands, the civilians who met them were stunned to find not conquerors, but caretakers. Soldiers distributed food, doctors treated children, and engineers rebuilt water lines. For the generation that had grown up on propaganda of demon Americans, this was disorientation turned to relief. And Japanese historians later wrote that the seeds of reconciliation were planted not in Tokyo's surrender ceremony, but in the moment the first Marine shared water with a captured soldier. That act, replicated countless times, quietly and anonymously, had reshaped the entire war's ending. In 1946, the U.S. government began collecting oral testimonies from Japanese POWs. Among them were hundreds of men who had survived because of Marine mercy. Their recollections were consistent, almost eerily so. They fed us. They treated our wounds. They called us by name. They gave us water. The same phrase, "they gave us water," appeared so often that it became symbolic shorthand in post-war Japan. Newspapers later referred to the occupation period as the time of water, when enemies quenched not just thirst, but hatred. One of the former prisoners, Corporal Yukio Tanabe, the man who had survived Iwo Jima thanks to Sergeant Dunham, became a teacher in Nagoya. He dedicated his life to peace education, telling students not about tactics or strategy, but about a single act of compassion. Every year on March 26th, the anniversary of Dunham's death, he poured a canteen of water over a small shrine and said, "This water saved me once. May it save others from hate." His students called it the ceremony of the canteen. It became local legend. Across the ocean, in small American towns, former Marines tried to live ordinary lives. Farming, teaching, working in factories. They didn't talk much about what they'd seen. But when they did, the stories weren't about victories. They were about moments. About the look on an enemy's face when offered kindness instead of death. One veteran, interviewed in 1972, said, "We thought we were there to destroy Japan. Turns out, we were there to learn forgiveness." Another, when asked what he felt looking back on it all, replied, "It's strange. The men I hated most, they're the ones who taught me what mercy means." The U.S. and Japan would go on to rebuild a relationship that became one of the strongest alliances in modern history. But beneath the treaties and trade deals was something far more fragile. A trust born out of moral shock. The Japanese had expected revenge. The Americans had expected resentment. Instead, they found mutual respect. That respect began with the smallest gestures. Food, medicine, clean water, but it grew into something that outlived both armies. When American veterans returned decades later, visiting the same beaches they had once fought on, they were greeted not with hostility, but with bows, flowers, and tears. In 1985, a memorial was unveiled on Okinawa, not to soldiers or generals, but to civilians and POWs, to all who suffered and all who forgave. At the ceremony, an American Marine and a former Japanese officer stood side by side, both old, both frail. When it came time to pour the ceremonial water onto the memorial stone, they lifted the canteen together. No one spoke. The gesture said everything. For historians, the Pacific War remains one of the most brutal conflicts in human history. But within that brutality lies a paradox, that the worst of humanity also revealed the best. That compassion, even when surrounded by carnage, could survive, and even change the course of nations. Military academies teach strategy and logistics. Few teach mercy. And yet, in the years after the war, some U.S. Marine training manuals began, including a simple passage adapted from chaplain records in 1945. Remember that mercy is not weakness. It is the strength that keeps men from becoming the monsters they fight. Generations later, the story of the Marines who shared their water lives on, retold in documentaries, in classrooms, and in whispered family histories. For Japan, it became a moral compass. For America, a mirror. And for the world, it remains proof that even in total war, where hate is taught, mercy is punished, and death is glorified, humanity can still disobey. One final letter, written by a Japanese POW in 1945, perhaps says it best. It was found decades later in an archive in Hawaii. The paper was yellowed, the ink faint, but the words were eternal. They told us the Americans had no soul. But when they gave us water, I saw their souls were full. I think perhaps that is why they won. And so, in the end, the Pacific War gave the world one last lesson. Not written in blood or victory, but in the simplest of gestures. Because history remembers armies, but humanity remembers moments. And sometimes, the smallest act, the passing of a canteen between enemies, can rewrite the story of a century. The war had taught them to expect cages, starvation, and execution. Instead, when the first groups of captured Japanese soldiers arrived at the American camps on Saipan, Guam, and Hawaii, what they found was almost incomprehensible. Clean tents, medical stations, meals served on time, guards who didn't strike them, who even smiled. For men who had been told all their lives that the enemy was inhuman, it felt like stepping into another universe. Private Shinjiro Takeda later recalled that moment. We had been told the Americans would torture us, but when I collapsed from exhaustion, one Marine carried me on his back. I could not believe a man could carry his enemy. The first night, the prisoners were silent. They didn't eat. They barely moved. They expected a trap, poison in the food, bullets after dark. But the next morning, the guards handed them breakfast again. Rice, canned meat, coffee. One guard pointed to the steaming mug and said, "Drink." When the prisoners hesitated, he lifted the cup to his own lips, drank, and handed it back. Only then did they begin to eat, and as they did, the fear began to crack. The camp commandant, Colonel Arthur Whitaker, had fought in the Pacific since Guadalcanal. He'd seen the cruelty of jungle warfare, but he'd also seen something else. That mercy broke enemies faster than bullets ever could. Under his orders, the POWs were to be treated according to the Geneva Convention, even though Japan had never signed it. When this war is over, Whitaker told his officers, these men will go home and tell their people how we treated them. That's the kind of victory that lasts. It wasn't sentimentality. It was strategy, the long game of compassion. In the first weeks, the camp doctors worked tirelessly. Malaria, dysentery, malnutrition. The prisoners were walking skeletons. American medics dressed their wounds, gave them vitamins, shaved their heads to remove lice. At first, the Japanese soldiers resisted, ashamed to be touched. Then, slowly, they began to trust the hands that helped them. One medic wrote in his diary, "They bowed to me today after I changed their bandages. I didn't expect that. I didn't know what to do, so I bowed back." Language barriers melted in small gestures. A Marine guard offered a cigarette. A Japanese sergeant carved a bird out of scrap wood and left it on the guard's table. A young American soldier, 19 years old from Ohio, taught prisoners how to play baseball during work breaks. By midsummer, the same men who once vowed to die fighting were cheering from the sidelines, yelling English words they barely understood. "Strike! Safe, run!" War had made them enemies. Humanity made them teammates. But outside those fences, few would have believed it. Back home, American newspapers still printed cartoons of the Japanese as monsters. And in Japan, families were still being told that those who surrendered were being butchered. The truth lived only inside those camps. In the shared laughter over a translation mistake, in the sound of Japanese voices singing old folk songs while American guards hummed along, the world saw division. Inside the wire, they found reflection. By late 1945, the number of prisoners swelled into the tens of thousands. They were transported to camps across the Pacific, from Guam to the Philippines to the U.S. mainland. In each one, the same transformation took place. Prisoners who arrived sullen and silent left months later writing letters to their captors. One note from a camp in Hawaii read simply, "We were taught you were beasts. Instead, you gave us our lives back. When we return home, we will tell the truth." And they did. Those words began to filter back through occupied Japan, smuggled in letters and oral stories. Families who had assumed their sons were dead learned that they were alive, not because they had fought to the death, but because an enemy had chosen to show mercy. For the first time, the myth of the merciless American began to collapse not through leaflets or propaganda, but through testimony from their own people. Historians would later describe it as one of the quietest revolutions of the war, the moral turning point, because the truth of those camps, that kindness could exist even in victory, began to ripple far beyond the barbed wire. When Japanese doctors and officers were finally repatriated in 1946, they brought with them not just memories, but philosophies. Several who had worked under American supervision founded post-war humanitarian organizations in Japan, promoting medical ethics and prisoner welfare. Many cited one simple inspiration: we saw how our enemies treated us. We learned from them. In one of the last surviving POW diaries, found decades later, a Japanese captain wrote, "I feared the Americans would kill me. Instead, they treated me better than my own officers ever did. I learned that honor is not dying for your country. It is living with dignity." The Marines who'd guarded him never knew his name, but they had rewritten his idea of what it meant to be human. By the time the war ended, 35,000 Japanese prisoners had passed through American hands. For many of them, the most unforgettable moment wasn't the day they were captured, but the day they realized they were safe. They had walked into captivity expecting hell, and instead, they found humanity. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the Pacific was not quiet. It breathed, a long, shuddering exhale after years of suffocation. The war had ended, but the silence that followed was not peace. It was disbelief. For millions, surrender meant humiliation. For others, it meant survival. And for a few, on both sides, it meant understanding. Across the ocean, letters began to move like ghosts through the mail, censored, delayed, translated, yet carrying the same heartbeat of revelation. Japanese prisoners writing home, American Marines writing to families about the men they once fought. Two sides finally speaking not through rifles, but through words. From a POW camp in Guam, Private Haruo Matsumoto wrote to his sister in Tokyo, "They feed us every day. I have eaten more rice here than during the last months of the war." The guards speak kindly. One even helped me write this letter. I do not know how to feel, ashamed, grateful, confused. But I know one thing. The Americans are not what we were told. The letter was confiscated by censors, but a copy survived, found later in U.S. archives. Historians studying it called it a turning point in truth. Meanwhile, in Iowa, Marine Corporal Joseph Martin, the same man who had given water to the surrendering soldier on Saipan, sat at his kitchen table trying to explain to his wife what had changed inside him. His hand shook as he wrote, "You'd think I'd remember the faces of the men I killed, but I only remember the one I didn't, the boy I gave water to. He looked at me like I was something impossible. Maybe that's what peace is, Ruth. When both sides stop believing the other is impossible." He never knew that his act had already been retold across the Pacific, shaping 1,000 other choices. Back in Japan, rumors of humane treatment had filtered through the ruins of cities. Families who'd spent years preparing funeral altars now received letters postmarked United States Army. Mothers wept, not just because their sons were alive, but because the world they'd been told to fear had shown them mercy. One woman, interviewed decades later, recalled the moment she opened her brother's letter. He wrote, "They are kind, that was all. I read it again and again, because those 3 words destroyed everything the empire had built on lies." In the American camps, friendship began to blossom in small, unspoken ways. A Japanese medic helped treat malaria among fellow prisoners. An American chaplain read from a Bible while a Buddhist prisoner bowed quietly in respect. Guards and inmates exchanged origami cranes, sketches, songs. These were not acts of diplomacy. They were acts of recovery, of rebuilding the human voice after years of being drowned out by propaganda. One of the most remarkable correspondences came from Okinawa. Sergeant Walt Dunham, before his death on Iwo Jima, had written a field journal that was found and stored by the U.S. Marine Corps. In 1947, the Japanese prisoner he had saved, Corporal Yukayo Tanabe, wrote to the U.S. military archives asking if Dunham's family could be found. His letter read, "There is a Marine who gave me water when all my world was fire. I wish to thank his family. I do not know his name, only that he was kind." The letter was forwarded to Kansas. When it reached Dunham's mother, she cried and placed it beside her son's Purple Heart. She told a local reporter, "That's better than any medal. My boy helped someone live." Even in universities years later, scholars studying post-war Japanese society noticed how drastically attitudes toward Americans shifted between 1945 and 1947, faster than in any other occupied nation in history. It wasn't just because of Reconstruction, it was because of memory. The memory of an enemy who had acted like a human being. Letters from POWs were read aloud in schools and churches. At first, they were controversial. Some nationalists called them traitors' lies. But gradually, they began to reshape the narrative. Children grew up hearing not only of Japan's bravery, but of compassion from the enemy. The myth of the inhuman American dissolved. One surviving Japanese officer said in a 1980 interview, "When I heard the first letters, I felt shame. When I met the men who wrote them, I felt peace." For the Marines, the letters had a quieter impact. They rarely spoke of kindness. They carried guilt for surviving what others didn't, and for seeing humanity in the enemy they'd been told to despise. One veteran wrote in his old age, "We were young, full of hate, but sometimes, when the fighting stopped, we saw something true. Maybe it wasn't about winning the war. Maybe it was about remembering we were still men." Those words, written decades later, could have been spoken by either side. By 1946, thousands of Japanese prisoners had been repatriated, returning home thin but alive. At the docks of Yokohama, reporters asked them what America was like. Their answers shocked the nation. They gave us shoes. They gave us water. They gave us mercy. It was simple, but it was enough to start undoing years of hatred. Historians often talk about victory as something measured in miles or battles, but the true victory of the Pacific War, the one that lasted, was written not on maps, but in letters. Letters soaked in gratitude, disbelief, and the rediscovery of humanity. For the first time, after years of annihilation, both sides had stopped seeing monsters, and in the space between those words, in the quiet between one heart and another, peace had already begun. Okinawa, May 1945. Rain fell like artillery from the heavens, endless, punishing, soaking through every uniform, rifle, and wound. It was the last great battle before the home islands, and everyone knew it. The Marines, hardened by years of blood and loss, were running on instinct. The Japanese defenders, trapped in a nightmare of collapsing tunnels, starvation, and broken faith, were clinging to what little honor their leaders had left them. By then, hate should have been the only thing left. And yet, it wasn't. Somewhere amid the carnage, a strange kind of understanding had begun to grow. Not in speeches, not in orders, but in the quiet choices made by individual men. Private First Class George Ramirez was 19. He'd been drafted from a small town in New Mexico and had never seen the ocean before the war. On Okinawa, he saw nothing but ocean. Ocean and death. One night, his squad captured 2 Japanese soldiers hiding in a drainage ditch. One of them was wounded, the other barely conscious from thirst. His sergeant said, "Leave them. They'll die by morning." But Ramirez couldn't. He looked down at the prisoners, 2 boys his own age, and saw not warriors, but versions of himself, just wearing different uniforms. He gave them his rations, even though food was scarce, and a drink from his canteen. When the platoon found out, some mocked him. "Trying to save the enemy now, Georgie?" one said. Ramirez didn't answer. He only muttered, "If I don't, what the hell's left of me?" A few days later, a mortar shell hit the ridge near where those prisoners were being kept. The same 2 men Ramirez had fed crawled toward the Marine camp, dragging one another through mud and shrapnel, shouting a single word: "Medic!" They weren't trying to escape. They were trying to help. They pointed to a collapsed trench where 2 wounded Marines were trapped, then helped dig them out with their bare hands. When questioned later, one of them said, "He gave me food." I could not forget. It wasn't a story that made the newspapers. But among the men who were there, it changed something. Okinawa was war distilled to its purest cruelty. Civilians dying beside soldiers, kamikazes screaming from the sky, and death so constant it became background noise. But in the cracks of that horror, small acts of conscience began to take root. A corpsman named John Davies carried morphine and bandages for both sides. He said, "If a man's screaming, I don't care what flag's on his sleeve." A Marine sniper stopped shooting when he realized his target was a medic dragging the wounded. A radio operator refused an order to shell a cave where children were hiding. They weren't heroes in the conventional sense. No medals, no glory. But they were something rarer. Men who refused to let the war finish what hatred had started. In one report written after the battle, a chaplain named Father Thomas Keegan described walking through the ruins of a village after the fighting. He found a Marine sitting beside a wounded Japanese soldier, holding his hand while he died. The Marine had given him morphine, then stayed until the end. Keegan wrote in his diary, "When I asked him why, he said, 'Because he was scared, and so was I.' That line, Two men afraid of each other, yet united in that fear, captured the entire tragedy and redemption of the Pacific War. Back in the U.S., newspapers showed only triumph. Flags raised, victories declared, enemies crushed. But among the men returning from Okinawa, something quieter was brewing. A moral fatigue, a need to believe that not every part of them had turned to stone. In interviews years later, veterans spoke not of battles, but of moments like these. A canteen shared, a word exchanged, a hand extended instead of a bullet fired. Sergeant Thomas Red Haskins, the same Marine who'd once handed a canteen to a dying enemy on Peleliu, survived Okinawa. He came home to a different kind of silence, one filled with ghosts, not glory. When asked by his pastor if he hated the Japanese, Haskins shook his head. "No," he said. "I hated what they made us do. But the man I gave water to, he looked like my brother." He paused. "You spend enough time in hell, you start looking for something human. If you don't find it, you don't come back." Meanwhile, back in Japan, the soldiers who had survived the American camps, men like Corporal Yukio Tanabe, began telling their stories. Not of glory, but of grace. They spoke at universities, at churches, even on the radio, saying things that once would have been punishable by death. The Americans were kind. They treated us fairly. They did not kill us when they could have. Their words shocked the public, then softened it. Even Emperor Hirohito, in his surrender broadcast, used language unheard of in Japanese history. Words of humanity and humility, not vengeance. He spoke of enduring the unendurable and seeking peace. That tone, historians believe, was influenced not only by politics, but by the testimonies of returning prisoners who had seen another way. A mercy that no ideology could erase. By the war's end, men like Haskins and Ramirez carried more than scars. They carried proof that even in the darkest places, compassion could survive. They didn't see themselves as saints. They still had nightmares, still carried guilt. But somewhere inside that suffering was a small ember of pride. Not for killing, but for refusing to forget their own humanity. Years later, when asked what he remembered most from the war, Ramirez said simply, "The kid I gave food to, not the ones I shot, the one I fed." In the jungles and caves of the Pacific, mercy had no orders, no strategy, no medal. It was improvised, fragile, and often unseen, but it endured, and, by enduring, it outlasted the hatred that had built the war itself. The Marines who refused to hate didn't win the battle for Okinawa, but they won something far greater, the battle for their own souls. The war was over. The world had split the atom, burned cities into shadows, and watched empires vanish in smoke. But from the ashes of the Pacific, something unexpected took root. Something small, quiet, and stubborn. It wasn't political. It wasn't strategic. It was human. It was the memory of mercy. From Saipan to Okinawa, from the jungles of New Guinea to the prison camps of Hawaii. The same story kept surfacing in letters, in journals, in trembling testimonies before peace tribunals, that compassion in the face of hatred had survived, that men who were taught to dehumanize had rediscovered the meaning of being human. In Japan's ruins, that memory mattered more than any declaration. Cities like Hiroshima and Nagasaki had become open wounds, physical and moral. But as Allied troops occupied the islands, the civilians who met them were stunned to find not conquerors, but caretakers. Soldiers distributed food, doctors treated children, and engineers rebuilt water lines. For the generation that had grown up on propaganda of demon Americans, this was disorientation turned to relief. Many Japanese historians later wrote that the seeds of reconciliation were planted not in Tokyo's surrender ceremony, but in the moment the first Marine shared water with a captured soldier. That act, replicated countless times, quietly and anonymously, had reshaped the entire war's ending. In 1946, the U.S. government began collecting oral testimonies from Japanese POWs. Among them were hundreds of men who had survived because of Marine mercy. Their recollections were consistent, almost eerily so. They fed us. They treated our wounds. They called us by name. They gave us water. The same phrase, "they gave us water," appeared so often that it became symbolic shorthand in post-war Japan. Newspapers later referred to the occupation period as the time of water, when enemies quenched not just thirst, but hatred. One of the former prisoners, Corporal Yukio Tanabe, the man who had survived Iwo Jima thanks to Sergeant Dunham, became a teacher in Nagoya. He dedicated his life to peace education, telling students not about tactics or strategy, but about a single act of compassion. Every year, on March 26th, the anniversary of Dunham's death, he poured a canteen of water over a small shrine and said, "This water saved me once. May it save others from hate." His students called it the ceremony of the canteen. It became local legend. Across the ocean, in small American towns, former Marines tried to live ordinary lives, farming, teaching, working in factories. They didn't talk much about what they'd seen. But when they did, the stories weren't about victories. They were about moments, about the look on an enemy's face when offered kindness instead of death. One veteran, interviewed in 1972, said, "We thought we were there to destroy Japan. Turns out, we were there to learn forgiveness." Another, when asked what he felt looking back on it all, replied, "It's strange. The men I hated most, they're the ones who taught me what mercy means." The U.S. and Japan would go on to rebuild a relationship that became one of the strongest alliances in modern history. But beneath the treaties and trade deals was something far more fragile, a trust born out of moral shock. The Japanese had expected revenge. The Americans had expected resentment. Instead, they found mutual respect. That respect began with the smallest gestures: food, medicine, clean water. But it grew into something that outlived both armies. When American veterans returned decades later, visiting the same beaches they had once fought on, they were greeted not with hostility, but with bows, flowers, and tears. In 1985, a memorial was unveiled on Okinawa, not to soldiers or generals, but to civilians and POWs, to all who suffered and all who forgave. At the ceremony, an American Marine and a former Japanese officer stood side by side, both old, both frail. When it came time to pour the ceremonial water onto the memorial stone, they lifted the canteen together. No one spoke. The gesture said everything. For historians, the Pacific War remains one of the most brutal conflicts in human history. But within that brutality lies a paradox, that the worst of humanity also revealed the best. That compassion, even when surrounded by carnage, could survive and even change the course of nations. Military academies teach strategy and logistics. Few teach mercy, and yet, in the years after the war, some U.S. Marine training manuals began including a simple passage adapted from chaplain records in 1945. Remember that mercy is not weakness. It is the strength that keeps men from becoming the monsters they fight. Generations later, the story of the Marines who shared their water lives on, retold in documentaries, in classrooms, and in whispered family histories. For Japan, it became a moral compass. For America, a mirror. And for the world, it remains proof that even in total war, where hate is taught, mercy is punished, and death is glorified, humanity can still disobey. One final letter, written by a Japanese POW in 1945, perhaps says it best. It was found decades later in an archive in Hawaii. The paper was yellowed, the ink faint, but the words were eternal. They told us the Americans had no soul, But when they gave us water, I saw their souls were full. I think perhaps that is why they won. And so, in the end, the Pacific War gave the world one last lesson. Not written in blood or victory, but in the simplest of gestures. Because history remembers armies, but humanity remembers moments. And sometimes, the smallest act, the passing of a canteen between enemies, can rewrite the story of a century.